Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another daily video Devo. Rene here, and today I'm in the famous Mamertine prison in Rome. Traditionally, this famous Roman prison, where many of the greatest enemies of the state were held, is where Paul endured his final imprisonment before he was put to death by the Emperor Nero. So it was very likely here in this prison that I stand in right now that the Apostle Paul wrote the final verses he ever wrote in his life in 2 Timothy chapter 4. It's interesting, this prison was a brutal place, a terrible place of suffering. It would have been very, very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer. Paul is writing these words in the wintertime, and in verse 13 of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he tells Timothy, "Please get to me as quickly as you can and bring my cloak," his winter coat, "and please bring my books and my writing parchments." Paul was a man after my own heart. Here he was in prison, and two of the three things he asks for are his books and his writing material, because he loved books and he loved to write. That was his ministry. And he says, "Bring my coat because it's very, very cold." But the most poignant verses in 2 Timothy 4 are the verses that he wrote starting in verse 6, where he says, "The time of my departure has come." And he says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Therefore, there is kept for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on his appearing on that day, and not to me only, but to all who have loved his appearing." You know, I think it's a good idea 2 or 3 or 4 times a year to read those verses, 2 Timothy 4, verses 6, 7, and 8, and ask yourself if your life, if it would end now, would reflect the truth of those verses, as they did for Paul's life. Let me recite them again to you. Paul says, "I am already being poured out like a drink offering here in this prison." He says, "The time of my departure has come. It's time for me to leave this earth." And he says about his life in retrospect, he says, "I have fought the good fight." Doesn't mean he's perfect, but it means when he got knocked down, he kept on fighting. Think of all that he had endured. He says, "I have fought the good fight." He says, "I've finished the race." He didn't quit when he fell down. He continued until the race was over. And then he says, "I have kept the faith." Of all the things that he did wrong, he kept the faith. And then he says, "Therefore, there is waiting for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day." And in case you're thinking, of course, Paul gets a reward. He's Paul. He says, "And not to me only, but to all who have longed for his appearing." Anybody who loves the idea, the return of Jesus, the Lord will award to him the crown too, because we are awarded not based on our merits, but on the grace of God. So I just want to encourage you to think of those verses from 2 Timothy 4, verses 6, 7, and 8, and regularly review your own life and say, "God, may my life live up to these verses that Paul spoke at the end of his life." From right here. I mean, he could speak such words of hope in a dungeon that looks like the dungeon you see behind me. Amazing. But he could do that because of practice and because of the power of the Spirit of the Lord living in him. So think about that as you go through your day today, and I know you are going to have a great one today. God bless you. Fight the good fight.